Imagine walking through the archives of the University of Halle. On one shelf, you have the works of 18th century philosophers, arguing for the age of reason.
Right.
On the next, you find the radical pamphlets of 19th century revolutionaries.
Yeah.
But then you hit the files from the 1970s, and the atmosphere just shifts.
It's a real change, isn't it?
It is. Tucked between scholarly papers on the Enlightenment are these reports, and they're destined for the Stasi, the East German secret police. It's such a jarring contradiction. You have academics who dedicated their lives to studying liberation and intellectual freedom, yet here they are operating as undercover agents for one of the most surveillance-heavy regimes in history.
They weren't just historians anymore.
No, they were activist scholars. They believed that the only way to truly understand the Enlightenment was to weaponize it for the socialist state.
So to them, the project of the Enlightenment wasn't some finished chapter of history.
Not at all. It was a living battleground. And this wasn't a new phenomenon. I mean, long before the Cold War, you had the left Hegelians of the 1840s who looked at the original Enlightenment thinkers and decided that mere writing wasn't enough.
The project had to be completed.
Exactly, through political fire and revolution. And even before them, the original pioneers like Nicholas Gundling were already blurring the lines between objective research and radical reform, driven by this belief that their time was uniquely capable of progress.
It makes you wonder.
It really does. At what point does a passion for enlightening the world cross the line into pure ideology? When a scholar stops being a detached observer and starts being a partisan champion for a cause, does the truth survive that transition? Or does it just become another tool for the powerful?
Looking at 3 centuries of this kind of activist history, well, the answer is far more complicated and I think a lot darker than you might expect.
That is precisely the contradiction we are diving into.
We're tracing this whole historical evolution of Enlightenment activism, this impulse to not just study the world, but to change it forcibly, if necessary.
Starting from its 18th century reformist roots.
All the way to its chilling ideological endgame in the 20th century. Our mission really is to understand this cautionary framework, how an intellectual commitment can devolve into political social engineering, and what happens when academic institutions decide to sacrifice objective truth for the sake of political utility.
Okay, let's unpack this history. We should start at that very moment the Enlightenment decided it had to leave the study and get into the streets. It's not enough to be a philosopher. You have to be a reformer.
Absolutely. The historical Enlightenment was never just a theoretical movement, confined to libraries. Its essence was practicality and progress. Our starting point is that 18th century reformist impulse. And it's really embodied by Nicholas Hieronymus Gundling, who taught at that very University of Halle we just mentioned. He wasn't just a jurist and philosopher. He was a historian who was deeply embedded in the politics of his time. This is from 1671 to 1729.
So what made Gundling stand out? How did he represent this initial impulse to reform?
Well, Gundling represented the Enlightenment's innate desire for immediate, tangible impact. This was an era, the early 18th century, where thinkers genuinely believed that their unique access to reason, to scientific methodology, meant they were better equipped than any generation before them to fix broken societal structures.
They felt a sense of urgency.
A huge sense of urgency. And Gundling's approach was radical for his time because he refused to separate his scholarly work from radical reform. He used his objective research, his historical studies, his philosophical insights as a direct blueprint for transforming the state and society.
So his goal was to bridge objective research with radical reform. He'd research a historical injustice and then immediately propose a practical progressive legal fix, for example.
Exactly. He viewed the university not as a retreat from the world, but as a motor for state improvement. His work was driven by this really optimistic view that theory must translate into practice for the betterment of the collective.
That initial impulse is so critical because it sets the precedent, right?
It does. The scholar has a political duty to act on their findings, but that impulse, while it's noble in its origins, it possesses this germ of intellectual danger, which accelerates dramatically as we move forward in time.
And that initial ambitious hope completely curdles by the time we reach the 20th century, specifically in the German Democratic Republic.
Yeah.
How did the pursuit of Enlightenment research in the GDR become so perfectly interwoven with the political machinery of the socialist state?
The GDR's approach is It's the logical, chilling endgame of this whole trajectory. In East Germany, Enlightenment research became less about finding objective truth and entirely about political activism for the socialist state and the Communist Party.
What was the logic there?
The underlying logic was this. The Enlightenment's principles, progress, reason, liberation, could only be fully realized in a communist system. Therefore, anyone researching the Enlightenment had a scholarly duty to demonstrate that historical path led inevitably to the GDR.
That just twists history into a propaganda tool.
It does, and the level of commitment became absolute. We see the darkest manifestation of this in the involvement of these activist scholars in undercover operations on behalf of the Staatssicherheitsdienst, the Stasi.
So there were professors and historians, but also spies.
Unofficial collaborators, or inoffiziell Mitarbeiter. They use their academic positions to spy on colleagues, to manipulate historical narratives. This entire framework, from the gentle reformist Gundling in the 18th century through the radical critiques of the 19th to the post-WWII era, it shows the steady, intensifying ideological progression.
And the GDR approach is the most extreme form.
It's the most outspoken and absolute form of academic activism. The academy as an arm of the state security apparatus.
That's a staggering betrayal of the Enlightenment's core principles of free inquiry. Let's really drill down into the human cost of that sacrifice of objective truth. The story of the young archivist, Hans, seems perfect for this.
Hans's story is a profound cautionary tale. He was a young man in 1970s East Berlin, utterly devoted to the Enlightenment. He truly believed the GDR represented the ultimate rational fulfillment of that project.
He was a true believer.
A true believer. He was dedicated to preserving and studying the works of thinkers like Gundling, seeing them as freedom fighters. His job was in the archive, handling original manuscripts. He was feeling the weight of history in his hands.
So for him, the archives were this sacred space of truth.
Exactly. But as he began cross-referencing original texts, maybe a 17th century treatise on liberty, with the state-approved history textbooks, he started to feel the friction. His devastating realization wasn't some sudden political epiphany. It was a slow, agonizing understanding that his job was not to preserve historical truth,
but to curate it.
To curate it. To manufacture a historical mirror that perfectly reflected the Central Committee's prevailing ideology.
Curate is far too sterile a word for the emotional and intellectual betrayal involved there. How specific were the instructions for this kind of historical revisionism?
Oh, they were brutally specific. Consider the concept of individual liberty, the cornerstone of the Enlightenment for thinkers like Locke and even many early German reformers.
Right.
The specific instruction Hans and his colleagues received was that every passage where an Enlightenment thinker praised individual liberty over the collective or over state interests had to be recontextualized as a historical error.
A historical error, meaning the original philosopher, Jess, they hadn't seen the light yet. They hadn't realized their ideas would ultimately be perfected by the collective state.
Precisely. They couldn't delete the passages because the original manuscript still existed.
Right.
But they could dictate the meaning of the passage. Liberty became a stepping stone to collectivism. Individualism became a temporary historical failing.
This act of intellectual submission, it illustrates the soul-crushing cost.
It does. Academic institutions stopped being lighthouses guiding society toward difficult, often uncomfortable truths, and they became mere mirrors for the powerful, reflecting back only the image the rulers wanted to see.
That transition from lighthouse to mirror is a perfect metaphor for political social engineering applied directly to the historical record. I mean, when the goal of the academic is defined solely by its utility to the ruling party, intellectual rigor just vanishes.
And that is the profound lesson here. The historical evolution of this activism, from Gundling's ambition to Hans's compromise, it shows that when objectivity is abandoned for political utility, the scholar is no longer engaged in the pursuit of knowledge. They're just reinforcing a political apparatus.
This betrayal of the past really sets the stage for the next crucial leap, doesn't it? The 19th century thinkers who decided that critique itself was a revolutionary weapon.
Exactly. Let's move to that vital transitional period, the 1840s and the young Hegelians. They were operating in a highly restrictive political climate in Prussia pre-1848, which forced their radical ideas to take root in specific kind of covert ways.
We are now moving into the deepest intellectual trenches of the 1840s. So hang on, because the next few names, like Feuerbach, Bauer, and Rouge, they might sound academic, but their ideas fundamentally shaped Marx and eventually our modern world.
Because political dissent was choked by strict censorship in Prussia, radical thought had to be channeled through less obvious fields.
So if you couldn't openly criticize the king or the government, where did you hide your political arguments?
You channeled them through theology. Religious criticism became the primary and safest vehicle for political dissent. The young Hegelians, often called the left Hegelians, were radical students and young thinkers orbiting the monumental philosophy of G.W.F. Hegel.
And they saw the Prussian state as fundamentally irrational.
Irrational and backward, but they couldn't attack it directly.
So instead of rejecting Hegel, who was the established philosophical giant, they performed a kind of intellectual jujitsu, claiming they were the true inheritors of his genius.
That was their primary strategy. They positioned their radicalism as the true fulfillment of Hegel's philosophical system. They accused the conservative establishment Hegelians of compromising Hegel's essential revolutionary spirit for political convenience.
And they pushed this idea of an esoteric Hegel.
Yes, a secretly revolutionary Hegel. They argued that his system was fundamentally atheistic and radical once you stripped away the cautious public formulations he used to survive censorship. Bruno Bauer's anonymous 1841 pamphlet, The Trumpet of the Last Judgment over Hegel, the Atheist and Antichrist, was key to this. It effectively gave the young Hegelians a revolutionary lineage.
They successfully weaponized critique by cloaking it in scholarly interpretation. But this intellectual radicalism didn't just stop at redefining Hegel. It spiraled outward into a comprehensive rejection of all existing structures.
It did, and it culminated in a spectacular act of philosophical self-destruction. This trajectory was pushed to its logical, nihilistic conclusion by Max Stirner. By 1844, Stirner's work, The Ego and Its Own, declared that if you reject God and the state, these external universal concepts, you must also reject every collective ideal that tries to replace them.
So he didn't just reject Christianity, he rejected the very idea of humanity or man, as his fellow Hegelians conceived of it.
Precisely. If God is an external authority, then Feuerbach's concept of man, this collective universal ideal, is just a new secular deity demanding submission. Stirner rejected all of it: God, state, morality, society, even collective humanity, in favor of the unique sovereign ego.
This radically isolated self.
The Einzig. It was answerable to nothing but itself. This rejection of all external authority, all universal ideas, essentially blew up the cohesive intellectual force of the young Hegelians by 1846. They had radicalized themselves out of existence.
And it's into this volatile, fragmented, hypercritical landscape that Karl Marx steps. He adopts the tools of critique developed by the Hegelians and applies them to the secular world of liberal rights and economics.
Right. This is where he makes his foundational distinction between political and human emancipation.
Marx's entire system is built on this pivot.
It is. He takes the young Hegelian critique of theological personalism, this focus on the isolated individual self, and transfers it to the realm of modern liberal rights. We see this most clearly in his response to the debate over Jewish emancipation at the time.
And this wasn't just an abstract debate.
Not at all. It was about whether Jewish citizens should be granted full political rights in Prussia.
So what were the practical strategies someone like Bruno Bauer was pushing for Jewish citizenship?
Well, Bauer, who was a critical figure for Marx, he presented three possible paths. First, conversion to Christianity. Second, a simple extension of rights already granted to Christians. Or third, the abolition of religion as a prerequisite for citizenship entirely. But his analysis led him to a paradoxical conclusion. In order for Jews to be truly free citizens, they would effectively have to renounce their religious specificity. He argued that if your religious code prevents you from fulfilling your duties to the state and fellow citizens if you can't participate in public business because of the Sabbath, then full citizenship is impossible unless you shed that religious identity.
So Bauer was arguing that political freedom required a certain degree of cultural and religious homogeneity, basically assimilation in exchange for rights.
That is the crucial point, and this is exactly where Marx intervened with his key distinction. Political emancipation is not the same as human emancipation.
Okay, break that down for us.
Political emancipation gives you civil liberties and rights, the right to vote, the right to property, freedom of conscience. But Marx argued this was insufficient because the politically emancipated citizen remains in thrall to private property and commerce.
Wait, if you have civil rights, how are you still in thrall?
Because the state, even the liberal democratic state, only guarantees the freedom of the self-interested individual, the bourgeois ego. It grants you the right to pursue your private interests, accumulate property, and compete in the marketplace. Marx saw this as guaranteeing alienation, not freedom.
So you're politically free to be an individual, but in civil society, you're still dominated by the conflictual dynamics of private property and the market.
Which treat you as a commodity, not a fully realized human being.
So simply having the vote and civil liberties doesn't make you truly free if the economic system itself dictates your life and creates inherent conflict.
Exactly. Marx's conclusion was that true democracy is incompatible with legal domination, and thus incompatible with a society fundamentally ruled by private property and commerce. Human emancipation, he suggested, only comes about when the real individual person recognizes and organizes their own forces as social forces, so that social power is no longer separate from them in the form of political or legal force.
And they saw Christianity as the ultimate expression of this alienation.
They did, not Judaism. They saw Christianity as the ultimate spiritual expression of this split between the self-interested individual and this sort of infinite heavenly freedom.
This philosophical shift, where the quality of an idea is judged not by its internal logic or objective truth, but by its political utility in achieving this total human emancipation, this is devastating to traditional concepts of competence. This is where we see the collapse of meritocratic standards begin.
This transition, where Enlightenment critique becomes a pure partisan political tool, is mirrored precisely in the contemporary collapse of objective standards. Let's revisit that cautionary story of the journalist in the 1840s, who was deeply influenced by firebrands like Arnold Rouge.
Tell me more about this journalist and his specific intellectual choice.
Well, this journalist was a competent writer, a critic of social and political issues. But as he internalized the young Hegelian doctrine of revolutionary urgency, he decided that merit, logic, and objective quality were nothing more than bourgeois traps.
Traps designed to do what?
Designed specifically to halt the progress of the revolution. If the current system rewards merit, then merit must be fundamentally rigged to protect the existing power structures.
So, if he stopped writing about the quality of the idea, what did he start writing about?
He stopped assessing arguments based on intellectual substance, evidence, or logical consistency. He started writing only about a person's political alignment, or whether their ideas served the revolutionary cause. The truth ceased to be something discoverable through shared reason and became whatever advanced the revolution.
The ideological outcome.
The ideological outcome.
That choice to prioritize political alignment over intellectual substance is profoundly destructive to the institutions that rely on competence.
Yeah.
And sounds terrifyingly familiar today.
It connects directly to modern pressures. Think about the contemporary researcher who was pressured to bury or recontextualize data simply because it did not align with the desired therapeutic goals of a social program.
Right, like if a study showed an intervention didn't work.
It might be suppressed because the narrative required the intervention to be an overwhelming success. This mirrors Rouge's thinking. The collapse of objective standards is seen as a necessary victory for a definition of justice or therapy defined entirely by political ideology.
And if competence and objective data are merely bourgeois traps, then you have to replace them with something else that ensures control and alignment.
You replace them with political loyalty. This is the crucial insight. This pattern mirrors the rise of the therapeutic state's intervention, replacing objective competence, the ability to perform a task well regardless of political belief, with ideological adherence.
And the ultimate consequence is
the loss of what we call organic social structures. These are the functional realities, the shared common sense consensus, and the meritocratic standards that allow a civilization to run smoothly. When the criteria for hiring a bridge engineer shifts from structural integrity to political compliance, the entire society is at risk.
The danger here is the profound loss of function. While the desire to dismantle genuine systemic injustices is essential, losing the ability to tell the difference between truth and a useful narrative risks institutional failure.
And this progression from Gundling's objective reform to Marx's total revolutionary emancipation to the left Hegelians dismissing logic as a bourgeois trap, it shows a clear historical path. The original Enlightenment commitment to reason is sacrificed for immediate political gain.
Which sets the stage for our darkest philosophical term, the Frankfurt School, which asked if reason itself was the problem.
Exactly.
So let's transition now to the mid-20th century and the neo-Marxist Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer. They look at the horrors of World War II, the rise of fascism, Stalinism, and asked a devastating question. If the Age of Enlightenment was supposed to lead us to a truly human, rational society, why did we descend into industrialized genocide and a new, terrifying barbarism?
Their central work, Dialectic of Enlightenment, was their attempt to explain this catastrophic failure. And their conclusion was radical. It wasn't that the Enlightenment had failed, but that the Enlightenment in its very structure was inherently flawed.
They argued that reason had become regressive.
Regressive and paradoxically repressive. Their central thesis is that the Enlightenment, in its obsession with systematization and control, is inherently totalitarian.
How does reason, the tool of liberation, become the tool of totalitarianism?
It becomes totalitarian by reducing the entire world to what can be encompassed by unity, numbers, and calculation, pure formal logic. The Enlightenment's ambition was to strip nature of its mythical qualitative power and replace it with quantitative universal scientific law.
Okay.
But this mathematical formalism arrests thought at near immediacy. Instead of deep critical analysis, which they termed the determining mogation, knowledge confines itself to reproducing and validating the actual state of affairs.
Let me make sure I follow that. By trying to make everything perfectly logical, measurable, and predictable, reason ends up merely confirming the existing oppressive reality because it lacks the capacity to imagine anything outside of what can be calculated.
Precisely. The more completely the machinery of thought subjugates existence to calculation, the more blindly it is satisfied with merely reproducing it. This leads directly to what they termed the self-perpetuating cycle of domination.
And this is tied to the idea of immanence.
Right. Enlightenment upheld the principle of immanence, explaining every event only by forces within the world against the older concept of mythical external forces.
Can you simplify that idea of immanence?
Think of it like a closed system. The principle of immanence says, everything that happens must be explained by the current observable reality. It's the rejection of magic, miracles, or anything outside the system. But the irony, Adorno and Horkheimer point out, is that immanence is the principle of myth itself. Myth is often built on cyclical motion, fate, and retribution. The idea that what happens now is merely a repetition of what has always happened, confirming a fixed internal order.
So the effort to break the compulsion of nature
only succeeds in reproducing that compulsion more rigidly within the subject's own thought.
So in seeking to master nature through pure logic, humanity only succumbs more deeply to the rigidity of a closed, predictable system, and abstraction itself becomes a tool of conformity.
Yes. Abstraction, the very instrument of enlightenment that allows us to generalize and categorize, acts as liquidation. It levels all differences and forces human beings into real conformity, creating the herd.
In this drive for world domination over nature.
It ultimately turns against the thinking subject itself. Both the subject and the object are nullified.
An abstract, self-confronting abstract material, what is left?
Only calculation. The abstract self, the generalized I think that accompanies all conceptions, confronts nothing but abstract material. Knowledge abandons the aspiration to think of existing things as having social, historical, and human meaning. It becomes mere perception, classification, and calculation.
And this regresses enlightenment back to mythology.
Exactly. It confirms the eternity of the actual and pronounces mere existence, the status quo, as the only possible meaning.
That is an incredibly bleak view of reason. And this view of reason as totalitarian calculation directly informed their analysis of mass culture, the culture industry. This is their concept for how social control is exerted in the 20th century.
The culture industry is the apparatus that produces, controls, and disciplines consumer needs across mass media. It takes a function that the philosopher Immanuel Kant expected of the subject, the schematism, and purveys it as a service to the customer.
Whoa, okay, we need to pause on Kantian schematism. That's high academic jargon. How can we simplify that for the listener?
Okay, so Kant's schematism, very simply, is the process your mind uses to link abstract concepts like cat to the sensory data you actually perceive, the furry, four-legged thing that just walked past. It's the mechanism of perception and understanding. Your brain actively processes the world to make sense of it.
And the culture industry does this work for you.
Precisely. Instead of the subject actively making sense of the world, the industry preforms the data.
So instead of thinking, we are just passively consuming a pre-digested reality. The mechanism of perception is outsourced.
And this passivity extends critically to leisure and amusement. Adorno and Horkheimer argued that the function of amusement is not an escape from a bad reality, it is an escape from the thought of resisting that reality.
Wow.
Amusement always means putting things out of mind, forgetting suffering. It serves to keep the masses in submission by denying the liberation that comes from critical, active thought that negates the necessity of the current oppressive reality.
So entertainment isn't just a distraction. It's a form of societal tranquilizer. that actively prevents intellectual rebellion. What is the core ideological mechanism that makes this industry the irrefutable prophet of the existing order?
The ideology is split into two complementary halves that work simultaneously. The first half is the photographing of brute existence, faithfully duplicating appearances and the actual state of affairs. The second is the blatant lie about its meaning.
How does that work in practice?
The industry maneuvers between demonstrable misinformation and obvious truth by simply repeating the existing order with utmost exactitude. This cynical reiteration of the monotonous power of repetition is enough to demonstrate its divinity.
The message is, look how perfectly functional and unavoidable this society is. Anyone who doubts this perfect picture is just irrational.
Exactly. It makes the culture industry the irrefutable prophet of the existing order. Critical thought is not just censored, it is made to seem irrelevant or delusional in the face of this overwhelming pre-digested reality.
This brings us to their analysis of the psychological mechanisms that underpin totalitarian compliance. They focused on anti-Semitism as a historical example of what they called false projection.
This analysis of paranoia is crucial to understanding how the herd accepts its own domination.
So what is false projection?
False projection is the psychological mechanism where impulses the subject doesn't acknowledge in themselves, like, say, their own lust for power, their own inability to cope, their own internal rage, are attributed to an external object, the victim. Mimesis is making oneself resemble surroundings. False projection is making the surroundings resemble the self.
Okay, so it's like when you're stuck in traffic, you get intense road rage, you attribute your own frustration, your own failure to anticipate traffic, or your own powerlessness to the moron in the car next to you.
That's a perfect relatable analogy.
You project your internal, unacknowledged rage onto an external, easily blamed object.
Exactly. And in fascism, this psychological mechanism of paranoia is adopted and formalized by politics. The object of the illness, the external enemy, is declared to be true to reality by the state, and any deviation or self-doubt is immediately labeled neurosis.
And the core problem is the exclusion of reflection.
The pathic element in anti-Semitism, they argued, is the exclusion of reflection. Instead of self-examination, you attribute your worst fears to others.
So instead of reflecting on their own internal contradictions, the individual attributes their lust for power to the enemy, attributing the protocols of the elders of Zion to their victims.
Yes. This unreflecting naivety, the blind acceptance of the projected external reality, is the shadow of cognition that threatens to dominate all culture. The unconditional realism of civilized humanity, this insistence on seeing things as they are without critical distance, culminates in fascism, which is essentially a special case of paranoid delusion.
The inability of the abstract self, which has been nullified by totalitarian reason, to grasp its own internal contradictions. It's a profound intellectual crisis that spans from the early Enlightenment optimism to this deep 20th century despair.
And this journey demonstrates how the pursuit of a perfected activist enlightenment can turn into its exact opposite, a dark, totalitarian instrumentalism that consumes its own principles. Now, we have to bring this thread forward to the present day and look at the illiberal mirror, how these critiques and ideological solvents are being leveraged against the entire Western project.
We see the contemporary anti-liberal and authoritarian intellectual movements consistently target not just specific policies or governments, but the foundational scaffolding of the West itself.
They are not critiquing policy, they're trying to dismantle the civilization. The central target is the core values of modern Enlightenment: science, technology, individual freedoms, religious toleration, and free markets, the very premises that liberal democracies are built upon.
And this anti-Western stance often goes beyond critique and culminates in outright nihilism.
Yes, destruction for its own sake.
What does that kind of nihilism look like in practice?
It's the deliberate attack on the idea of civilization itself. Think of advocating for the destruction of industrial factories because they represent domination, or the abolition of classical music, or the defacement of precious works of art that represent historical achievement. It is an explicit philosophical choice to prefer nothingness nihil to cultural achievement, because the achievement itself is viewed as hopelessly contaminated by oppression.
And this contemporary opposition, this counter-enlightenment, appears to be splitting its forces.
That's right. We see a convergence on the destruction of the liberal center, but from two different ideological fronts. On one side, you have those seeking a return to traditional, often religious philosophies, seeking to resist modern values by reviving old ways.
And on the other?
On the other side, you have those seeking to destroy the Enlightenment to move toward a collectivized or socialized regime, rejecting science and technology because they view them only as regimes of control and calculation, echoing the Frankfurt School critique.
What's truly fascinating, and often confusing for the listener, is the phenomenon of the modern post-liberal right, adopting tactical elements that originated with the radical left we just discussed.
This is the illiberal mirror effect. Despite vehemently opposing progressivism and modern identity politics, certain segments of the modern post-liberal right are channeling the radical Enlightenment's commitment to perpetual revolution and change.
So they're rejecting crucial American foundational premises like limited government and natural rights,
which had historically been guarded by fusionist conservatism. They are using the intellectual solvent created by the radical left, the dismissal of Lockean concepts, the critique of foundational rights as merely tools of power, to attack the very moderate liberal tradition that the right historically defended.
The result is this identity crisis.
It is. In their zeal to overturn the perceived failures of American traditionalism, they embrace critiques that are fundamentally foreign to the Western liberal experience. By rejecting the moderate Enlightenment figures like Locke, they risk embracing the same structural critiques that socialists and nationalists have wielded for 2 centuries to dismantle the existing political order.
So the post-liberal right, in this sense, is becoming a mirror image of the very radicalism they claim to reject.
Precisely.
Let's connect this to the everyday experience of losing shared consensus, the feeling that we've lost the ground beneath our feet. This is where the modern educator's experience comes in.
The modern educator's experience provides a perfect, painful anecdote for the culmination of this historical process. Imagine that professional feeling like they are standing on shifting sand.
That must feel completely disorienting.
It is, because every time they appeal to a universal value or a shared common sense premise like the need for objective truth in data or the inherent value of classical education, it's dismissed immediately, not on its merits.
But as merely a tool of oppression wielded by a dominant group.
Exactly. The progression from left Hegelian activism, which rejected merit as a bourgeois trap to modern identity politics, which rejects universal values as tools of oppression, is a consistent pattern.
It's a consistent pattern of dismantling the traditional institutional guardrails and common sense consensus necessary for a stable Western civilization.
Yes. The young Hegelians began viewing every tradition as an intellectual solvent to be melted away. Today, that solvent has been refined and applied to everything from meritocratic hiring to basic scientific processes. And while acknowledging the crucial need to dismantle genuine systemic injustices, the danger remains profound, losing the functional reality, the common ground that keeps civilization operational.
We've seen the danger of sacrificing truth for immediate political action throughout this deep dive, from the Stasi scholar to the journalist who rejected merit. But what is the fate of the critical thinker who refuses to yield thought to immediate political action? What about the importance of unyielding theory?
This brings us to the profound paradox concerning the tension between pure critical thought and the need for active reality or praxis. On one hand, thought that detaches itself from active historical power risks becoming baseless, purely speculative, mere whimsy.
It's easily dismissed by the righteous realists.
Yes, the ones who demand thought align with powerful social tendencies. If you aren't doing the work, you aren't relevant.
So logic and consistency often align with the side of power and prevailing reality?
Exactly. But the Frankfurt School theorists argue that true praxis, the kind capable of fundamentally overturning the status quo, depends precisely on theory's refusal to yield to oblivion. Unyielding theory must dare to abolish the false absolute, the principle of blind power or domination, even if in the process it appears impractical, contradictory, or even mad in the eyes of the reigning social logic.
So critical thought has to be willing to contradict the prevailing logic of the system it criticizes, even at the cost of being temporarily irrelevant.
It is the only path, the only way out of the compulsion of domination, which even the socialist systems prematurely confirmed as eternal necessity, is for the mind's self-recognition as nature divided from itself. The critical thinker, in the refusal to conform, is capable of recognizing the necessity, the rigid mechanism of compulsion that reflects and perpetuates nature in its unreconciled form.
And this ability to look at the system and say, This is unnecessary, this is merely compulsion, is what keeps thought opposed to power.
By not surrendering the concept to reality, the critical standpoint, a materialism that dispenses with the prejudice of regarding any moment of existing material reality as directly positive, is maintained.
This has been a necessary, sweeping, and often dark look at a very long historical line. We started with Gundling's reformism, moved through the young Hegelian's radical critique of liberal rights, and culminated in the Stasi scholar and the Frankfurt School's totalitarian analysis.
We have. We've traced how intellectual activism, driven by the desire to complete the Enlightenment project, consistently led abstract ideas to be weaponized. The initial impulse for progressive reform steadily intensified into a commitment to impose a specific vision of order, often resulting in the very coercion and oppression the ideas were meant to combat.
Whether by sacrificing objective truth to the state, dismissing competence as a bourgeois trap, or defining reason itself as inherently totalitarian.
The history of Enlightenment activism is a history of abstract ideas being weaponized to impose a vision of order, often resulting in the very oppression the ideas were meant to combat.
What stands out, and what we owe the listener a final thought on, is the complex tragedy of human reason itself. The mind, and all that is good in its origins and existence, is hopelessly implicated in the horror of domination. Our scientific advancements, our complex understandings, our ability to organize and master the universe, all of it comes from a sophisticated division of labor and a relentless adaptation that exists at the expense of nature.
Indeed. Every philosophical concept, every tool, and every piece of organization serves the same purpose of relentless adaptation and mastery. Reason, therefore, acts both as the organ of calculation that sets humanity free from the blind forces of myth, and as the sophisticated instrument of self-preservation that makes humans beasts with an ever wider reach, constantly seeking to dominate and categorize, sometimes at the expense of their own critical freedom.